again, I'm not imputing any like intent to deceive on any of these people. I just view it as like context for like how to take their statements, like how literally to take their statements. When I see someone like that who
Mm.
basically has, I would say, really clear evidence that Joseph Smith can't do what he's claiming to do, according to his own testimony, like he never found the treasure that he was looking for, it's very hard for me then to take, his account of being kind of an unofficial witness of the plates all that seriously. But maybe I'm being too harsh on Josiah.
I sort of see it as, for me, I feel like both are quite hard to believe and miraculous. And obviously,
Sure.
with my own spiritual experience, that's ultimately why I lean with faith. But I think for me, even if I didn't have that spiritual belief, I would still think, man, like, how did Joseph pull that off? Like, that's an incredible fraud. Like, if you did those three things, I'd be
Hmm.
like, my goodness, Colby, that's impressive. Doesn't mean it's true, but I think like
Hmm.
I have to take this quite seriously because I don't know if anyone today could replicate that,
Hmm.
and therefore, am I sure that I think Joseph Smith was able to do that? Like, if there is the divine and the miraculous, if God can do miracles, this is probably a more compelling case. Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and truth claims. And in today's episode, I have joining me Kolby Reddish, who is a former member of the church, and he is involved very much online and in critical podcasts. And we're going to be having a chat and a discussion a bit about the witnesses of the gold plate. So, Kolby, welcome. It's nice to have you on.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to talk to you. I told you, you're one of the few believing podcasts I still listen to. And I really value what you do on your channel. I think it's interesting, the journey you've been on.
Oh, I appreciate that. That's a huge compliment. And I feel like I said this to you before that I already kind of know you because I've listened to you on a lot of podcasts as well. You've been on Mormon Stories quite a lot and also Mormonism Live, and you've been doing a series with RFM, Responding to Light and Truth Ladder as well. But I think it's good for us to have these conversations. I think you feel the same about not
Hmm.
being in an echo chamber. I think particularly in light of the recent events a few months ago with the Charlie Kirk assassination and the shooting at the church in Michigan, I think it was a time where I realized that the political or religious divides we have, it's not good to be in our echo chambers to see the other side as liars or the enemies, and we need to try to be better at having civil conversations and dialogue with each other and talking with people that we disagree with and not labeling them as liars or the enemies. And I think particularly in the space of Mormonism,
Hmm.
apologists and critics or believers and unbelievers, we struggle to have conversations with each other and can often talk quite bad about the other side. So I think we both feel that we want to have a civil discussion. I remember watching you on Steve's show a couple of months ago and I said, hey, I think
Hmm.
Colby he seems a reasonable guy. I think we could have a nice conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with everything you said. And it's funny, I have tried to take a more expansive view really since the events in Utah with Charlie Kirk, just trying to realize like the road we were on, or the road I feel like society is on, is frankly untenable. And so I really do believe in trying to have these types of conversations. I really do. Because there's nothing to say that we can't have a conversation about.
Yeah.
Um, that's super kind, even about the reasons that we disagree, right? I think that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to have this conversation today, because I've watched enough of your material to know you're really informed and also super honest. And so I
Oh,
tend to think of
thanks.
myself the same way. So it's like we can just have a great conversation about why we see evidence maybe differently and where our paths diverge. And
Sure.
I think there's also something about both the Mormon slash ex-Mormon experience that we both need to recognize. Um, it's corny to use a quote from Joseph Smith, right? But his, as the ex-Mormon that's having the conversation, but his statement at one point that, no one would understand or no one would believe, he wouldn't believe what happened to him unless he had experienced it, right? He said that in one of the accounts of his history. And I think there's a truth in that for all of us a little bit, right? You have certain experiences that inform the way you approach the world that kind of brick by brick can explain why you got the way why you see the world the way that you do and why you understand things the way that you do. And I think that's, to me, one of the most interesting things about the conversations I've had in this space is like even last night, I was talking to a guy who went to the route of ex-Mormonism and then went to Catholicism. And I was just asking him like a series of questions about like why that resonated with him. So it's interesting to see the way that those experiences do inform each of our journeys.
Absolutely. No, I think it's important to listen to people's different perspectives and journeys. And I think one thing that I can relate to with a lot of people who are ex-Mormon or even critical is
Hmm.
my own faith crisis, and I perhaps wouldn't be able to have as much understanding or empathy if I had not gone through it myself. And often in the church we can label people who lose faith or step away as, well, they're apostates or they're dishonest or there is some secret insidious motive for them
Hmm.
leaving. And I think it's recognizing that reasonable, honest, good people with integrity can come to different conclusions. That
Hmm.
they might step away or they might have experiences that bring them back or cause them to believe. And people can come to different conclusions on things. And we can sort of, this will be a good discussion to talk about the things that we agree on and the things where we see things differently in
Hmm.
our differences or the distinctions. But I first off feel like since my faith crisis that I have a lot more epistemic humility. Often in the church we grew up with, I know you have this certainty. And I felt for the first 21, 22 years of my life, I felt like I really knew, had very strong spiritual experiences, and everything up until that point pointed to it being true. There's not really any reason for doubt. And then, it was sort of a flip 180 with the faith
Hmm.
crisis. And then even since returning and returning to belief again, I have a lot more epistemic humility. So I don't come
Hmm.
from the position of I know or have any certainty. And I feel like I understand those people who don't believe. And when it comes to, for example, we're going to have a discussion on the witnesses. I'll share some reasons why I think they're um, interesting or I find them somewhat compelling, but why I don't find it definitive evidence or proof by any means. And I can understand why someone wouldn't accept them as evidence and that they're still reasonable and honest. And I also feel like I have to approach this from some humility, recognizing I could be wrong.
Sure, sure. Yeah. And I think all of us have to have that, right? Knowing how to make those decisions, how to weigh different epistemologies, I think is one of the most, it's probably one of the things I talk about most kind of in the XMO podcast arena is just like critical thinking, logical fallacies. And the reason I do that isn't because I think I'm perfect at it. It's because I feel like that's the biggest thing that changed in me after my faith crisis was really re-examining the reason I had weighed evidence and had accepted certain arguments. I think that's probably the single biggest thing that changed in me. It's interesting that you talked about that certainty. I feel like that maybe is a difference between our like younger versions.
Mm.
I feel like I had a friend that was very close to me that left the church in like early 2013, 20 like between 2013 2015 timeframe. And he had asked me as part of his leaving the church and just conversations we had had about reading the CES letter. So like I had read the CES letter when it was first published. I think like before it was even like in its more finalized format, like
Oh, wow.
the original more snarky version, and then had just continued on in the church for a long time because I found ways to kind of resolve and make sense of some of the issues in it.
So this would have been back in
And
what, 2012, 2013? Because
yeah, I
I
think
believe you didn't step
2013,
away from the
20
church till what, 2021?
2022. Yeah. So basically for about a decade, I would say it's not like I was doing any form of apologetics or anything. It really was just my own study, and trying to make sense of these things. But my last calling in the church actually before I left was I taught all 4 years of the adult gospel doctrine in our ward. And I just loved that.
Wow.
It was a fantastic
I would love
calling
that
for me to
calling.
just, yeah, it was so great. The thing I liked most about it is I really liked teaching some of the, I don't want to say like controversies, but just teaching some of the things I thought were interesting. Like I remember the Old Testament year when we were dealing with the story in Genesis. I was very much, as a believer, I was someone who saw God's hand in like the origin of life and evolution.
Hmm.
conversation. And I thought it was very interesting that you can see some pretty clear parallels in the Genesis account of that. And I remember not explicitly teaching that in my kind of creation Genesis lesson, but just hinting at it. And the thing that was so interesting was like basically everyone under 40 in the ward came up to me after church and said like, oh, we appreciated that so much, like how to make sense of these two things that can fit together, right? That they can be harmonized. And then
Mm.
everyone over 40 came up to tell me how heretical and, you know, how I need to be careful about talking about that evolution stuff, even though I never
That's not what it
used
says
that
in
word.
Mormon doctrine, priest armor concrete.
That's right. That's right. So,
Well, maybe before we dive into the witnesses, because the reason we picked the witnesses was a couple of years ago, I did a response video to two
mhm,
episodes on Mormon Stories. It was part of the LDS discussion series, and I had done a lot of research. I had already done some episodes on the witnesses, some interviews, and I wanted to do a response to it. And I remember you sent me some messages. I think you did a post on Reddit, and we talked about maybe doing an episode, but it didn't happen. But we thought like, hey, we should have a
mhm,
collaboration, and why don't we talk about the witnesses? But before we dive into the witnesses, maybe in a couple of
sure.
minutes you could briefly tell us your background and briefly what sort of caused you to step away from the church. Maybe you could also talk about, were the witnesses ever part of your testimony growing up, or were you ever sort of impacted by the testimony of the witnesses, and then how did you view them in your faith crisis, and then now as you've lost your faith?
Yeah, great question. I'll start by saying so I grew up in Boise, Idaho. I've basically lived my entire life in Idaho, aside from my mission, which I served in Arizona, and then my time at BYU in Provo. So I graduated from BYU Provo, married my wife at BYU Provo, and we had one kid graduating from BYU. So that was kind of wild. And then I went to law school here in Boise, graduated from law school, I've worked as an attorney basically now for the last decade, primarily in the public sector. So that's basically kind of like my background as far as professionally. And I only bring that up to say my experience, I think, having gone to law school. And I also have been an adjunct professor for several law schools over the last like 7 years. So I only say that to give people just a little bit more insight into like why I think the way I do. I feel like my experience in law school really shaped the way I think. For
Mm.
undergrad, my degree, it's a weird pivot to go to law school after this, but my undergrad degree is actually in micro and molecular biology. So I was
Oh.
more of a hard science guy in my undergrad. And I also feel I only, again, share that to also inform that that's a big part of the way I think too. I've always, since I was a really young kid, been super interested in science and nature. And actually, I would say probably the biggest testimony builders for me, or the biggest ways I felt the divine throughout my life, were in connection to outside and mountains and animals and seeing kind of like the beauty of the creation around me. But it's not always just beauty. There's also like death. And so you've got these kind of inherent tensions that I think religion speaks to very well. And so I found meaning in those stories. I would say my growing up in the church was pretty conventional in the sense that like my family did family prayer and scripture reading, very kind of normal Mormon experience. I did serve a mission a little later than most people. I didn't leave till I was about 21. And that was because my dad didn't serve a mission, my grandpa didn't serve a mission. And the reason I delayed was in part because of a high school relationship I had. And the other in part was because I really wanted to be sure that if I was going to go and spend 2 years as a missionary, that I was absolutely sure that that's what I wanted to do. So I would say I really did have this period in my late teen years, early 20s, where I really did have to decide for myself whether I had a testimony of the church's truth claims or I didn't. And at the time that I was, graduating from high school, it was basically it was like one of several minor Mormon moments, I would say, in the sense that it's when South Park featured the Joseph Smith episode was about that same time frame. So there were
Oh,
people
okay. With
talking
Martin
about
Harris and the stone in the
yeah,
hat.
yeah, dumb, 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 dumb. Yes. So I remember learning about those things and doing a little bit more digging. I think one of the things that's interesting about that experience is at the time I had never like ever had a conversation with an ex-Mormon that hadn't pivoted to another type of Christianity. And so I think at least what I experienced in those times was, and this was like early internet, like reading, trying to find more information. I feel like what I experienced was like legitimate anti-Mormonism. And I only say that because I think sometimes that term can be used very, very broadly to mean like any criticism of the church or any criticism of any decision made by a leader of the church. And in my view, like actual anti-Mormonism is like criticisms of Mormonism to lead someone to some other like faith system or belief system that's religious. So it's usually like comparing and contrasting like more conventional Christianity with, Mormonism. That's the way I viewed it, at least. So
Mm.
weirdly, I feel like that hidden motive that I sensed in a lot of like the material I was reading back before I served my mission kind of immediately turned me off to any of the criticisms. So all of this is like before the gospel topics essays. I feel like my age of folks in the church had a very, very different experience from people even like my younger siblings' age, because they were better informed as far as like things in the gospel topics essays, like big controversies in the church.
Right.
Um, and I also just feel like I experienced some really, really outdated teachings just kind of as a consequence of like what seminary teacher you have, what Sunday school teacher you have. Like, for example, I remember in 2004 in seminary being taught like explicitly Curse of Cain doctrine and coming home and
Mm.
telling my parents, like, well, I don't believe that's true. So you kind of like find ways to like make sense of fallible teachers, fallible leaders, fallible prophets, even. And so I feel like I'm spending way too long on my background.
No, no, keep going.
Yeah, I so I guess in law school, um, and then having graduated from law school, I think an experience I'd share that was really, really one of those bricks in the road for me that was really formative was one of my first jobs out of law school was working as a criminal prosecutor. And working as a criminal prosecutor like taught me a lot about a world that I really didn't understand. I in fact started prosecuting a few like child sex crimes during my time in that office before I decided I would like to do anything other than prosecute child sex crimes. And so that experience really, I think, made me confront issues of the problem of evil in a way that I had never really had to before. I remember one very, very difficult case. I only worked on it very briefly, like for video arraignments, basically like the first day someone appears in court. But it was a child abuse and neglect case that ended up in a 9-year old having, lost his life as a result of this situation. And I feel like, in a lot of ways, even though I would continue on in belief in the church for another, 5 or 6 years after having that experience, well, I shouldn't say 5 or 6, probably like 3 or 4. I feel like that experience was very formative for me in seeing the problem of evil in a way I just never had before. It got very difficult for me to continue my belief in like a interventionist God, just having seen some of the things I saw connected to that case.
Yeah.
Um, and so my belief in God, I think, got a lot more deistic over time, like basically believing that there was still so much good in the system, good morals, good teachings, but believing that while the scriptures were well intentioned, they were very likely exaggerations of actual events, because it was just very hard for me to square the level of intervention in people's lives that we see in the scriptures versus like the situation that I had witnessed, and basically having to grapple with like, why not save this little boy? But then, especially if you're going to church with people who haven't really experienced that darker side of life, and
Yeah.
you're hearing like messages and testimony meeting about, people. I know it's the joke, but I promise I really did hear it at the time. Like people losing or finding their lost car keys or finding their lost pair of glasses. It's really, really difficult to like accept testimonies like that when you've
God
seen.
intervened over those small situations, but then something really big like a child being abused or killed. Why didn't he intervene
Yeah,
then?
yeah, exactly. Like that's exactly what I grappled with. I think the real reason, though, that my faith I would say the real thing that catalyzed my faith crisis was in 2021, and I did share the details of the story on Mormon Stories, episode 1550, if people want more background on it. And I bring plenty of receipts and everything because, by nature of being an attorney, that's just kind of the way I think about the world, right? Um, the real issue that brought my faith crisis, I'd say, to a head and catalyzed it and caused me to basically re-examine my faith was our sitting bishop in 2021 was charged with abuse of children, like sexual abuse of children. It wasn't directly connected to his church service, to be clear. I'll kind of be a little vague because I like to, give as much anonymity and protection to victims and survivors of abuse as I can. Um, and people can look it up. It was reported in the news here locally, but basically the experience that I had with our ward kind of rallying around someone who had been charged with some rather serious, and when I say rather serious, I mean the most serious for our state child sex abuse crimes, really caused me to question and look at the ward and basically start to have this realization that, like, I don't have a whole lot in common with these folks I'm going to church with aside from like this one set of beliefs, because there were other things that were going on at the time, as far as like our ward and stake's response to COVID, that I just didn't super agree with. And so I feel like that kind of brought to a head experiences with our stake leadership and then even with the area leadership that, again, I describe in great detail in this Mormon Stories episode. And it doesn't really matter here. I'll just say that what it caused for me and my wife was caused for us to basically say, okay, we feel like we need to take more seriously our duty of figuring out what we believe as far as the church goes, instead of being more comfortable with letting some of our doubts, to borrow the phrase from Camilla Kimball, like leaving some of those doubts on the shelf. It became more of a time for us, especially because churches were, at least here, churches were still remote and stuff with COVID. It gave us an opportunity to basically go through and re-examine our beliefs. And the way we did that was by starting with the church's gospel topics essays, going through them basically night overnight, reading them together, reading the footnotes, doing additional study. And we did that in part because at the time they came out, they were initially released, I was in law school and I was working 3 jobs and we had 2 kids. Like, it just wasn't a time that, and I sincerely mean this, I was not in a place in my life to have any type of faith crisis. Like, the church, I needed the church as a sense of stability in my life in a very, very difficult time in my life. I don't think I would have gotten through all that we had on our plates in that time without
And
those
also, if you're
beliefs.
working between 3 jobs and a couple of kids and at law school, I can remember being in a similar situation in my last year of uni, jumping between 3 jobs before getting married to my wife. And that was just a time where you've got no time to really dive into these things and research as well. You couldn't
Yeah,
deal with it.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I was literally on 3 or 4 hours of night or of sleep a night, just having to work, do full-time school, studying. I don't know if you know this, but law school, they make you read a lot. So there was a lot of
I can
reading.
imagine.
And yeah, so as we evaluated the gospel topics essays, um, there were just so many things I felt like were huge shifts in the narrative I had been taught from the church. Book of Abraham has become a big issue for me and something that I've done a ton of study on. My wife still jokes and reminds me of the time that I felt like I finally understood all of the issues in the Book of Abraham essay and in the Book of Abraham controversy. And she reminds me that I woke her up at like 4 o'clock in the morning, ranting like a lunatic that I had finally figured it all out. And I'm sitting there showing her like rudimentary Egyptian that I've learned to make sense of all of this stuff. And I would give a huge shout out to Dan Vogel for his book on that topic. I feel like it does a really good job of walking people through the actual documents and the timeline, because I think once you understand those two pieces, then you have a much better way to make sense of what's going on with those documents. But anyways, as my wife and I went through that, at the same time, we were in communication with the stake and area president about policies we would suggest for the church to change when it comes to its handling of child sex abuse issues and matters. And it just so happened that as we had had a series of meetings with them over a few months, they had basically explained to us, like, at this point, you need to write a letter to Salt Lake, and they were super supportive of us doing that. I remember the area president saying that our letter was expected at the highest levels of the church. So when we sent the letter and really didn't receive any response aside from basically like a blow off, is how it felt like, um, based on everything we'd experienced in our ward, basically saying, no, everything that happened was done correctly, which I just still to this day boggles my mind. Um, it just so happens we received that blow off letter on a Saturday, and the very next Monday in 2023, I believe it was, or maybe it was late 2022. I think it was 2022, is when Mike Resendez broke the story about the Arizona Bisbee sex abuse case. And we just decided at that point that while I can't really explain it, I think most people in the church, including the highest levels of the leadership, have good intentions on this issue. I, for the life of me, don't understand why there are certain policies are the way that they are, and I just felt like I can't continue to lend my name to an institution that doesn't have any interest in. At least this is how it felt to me. That doesn't have any interest in fixing these problems that have, propped up for decades or popped up for decades. And so my wife and I and our oldest, who had been baptized about the year before, ended up resigning from the church. And so since then, you asked me kind of how I stumbled into the Exmo space. Honestly, it's just because I was raised Mormon, so I don't know how to say no when people ask me for help. And I mean that. I just like having these interesting conversations. And I think this space, whether you're on the believing side of the line or on the Exmo side of the line, I think this space is really difficult for a lot of people. And there's a lot of people hurting on both sides of this space.
Yeah.
And so, even though I know I haven't been perfect at this, I really try and just share my perspective and how I've made sense of the system that I was raised in and kind of reconsidered the evidence. I try and share that with as much epistemic humility as I can. And if it's valuable to folks, then it's valuable to folks. If they don't agree with me, then they don't agree with me. But at least I try and give voice to some of those concerns. And the big reason I started doing that is as I was going through my faith crisis and reading the gospel topics essays, I really found the only resources that I was able to locate were kind of your more older school, conventional, really nasty, frankly, apologetics, less pastoral apologetics like the Gibbons and Patrick Masons. I'm talking like some fair material that I just felt like was really mean spirited and often felt, as I'm the one in the faith crisis, felt to me like a big blame reversal. Like you're the one who didn't understand church history accurately.
It was your
Um,
assumptions.
yeah, your assumptions, that type of rhetoric, I felt like was really difficult for me to process as I was going through my faith crisis. So there were a few voices on the critical and believing side that I felt like weren't that way. And so honestly, the biggest reason I started doing any type of like podcast appearance was just to try and do the same thing. To feel like if people are not able to make sense of it any longer, that I want to like validate that to say like you're not crazy and you're not wicked and you're not sinful because this isn't making sense to you anymore. If it still is making sense to folks, I am also super supportive of that. I have like really close friends that I have lunch with pretty regularly that are in bishoprics here locally, and we still talk about like church issues and stuff. So I think it's one of the weirdest things about the ex-Mormon identity is like you have both good and bad feelings towards the church, its senior leaders, Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, because you recognize, or at least I recognize, that there's so many things about the person I am that were shaped by Mormonism and things that I'm like grateful for. And yet it gets more complicated than that when you start to ask like, but was it their right to like make me pay certain costs to get some of those benefits? So hopefully that makes sense. Do you
No,
have
it
any
makes sense.
questions about that? And then I can answer your follow-up question about the witnesses
Yeah,
directly.
yeah. Well, I guess I sort of had a comment that,
Sure.
in some ways I can resonate with that because often we'll say to people when they leave the church, oh, they can leave the church, but they can't leave it alone. But as you said, that it's such a huge part of your identity, your
Mhm.
worldview, your upbringing. So much of who you are is shaped by the church and the gospel and the experiences you had. And I think often people can go through this season of betrayal and anger, but it also seems that you recognize still some of the good as well, some things that you no longer believe in or or disagree with. And what was my other comment I was going to say? Oh, I can't remember. Well, if it comes back to me, I'll say it again. Uh,
Great.
so, did you sort of go through that feeling of betrayal, and then maybe just talk about then how did you then view maybe some apologetics, and then, for example, then talk about like the witnesses, and were they something that you ever thought about during your faith crisis? Were they a meaningful part of your testimony beforehand, and then what about sort of now the way you look at it?
Yeah. So, as far as feelings of betrayal, yes, I absolutely feel feelings of betrayal. My wife and I served in the same mission, and we had a packet in our mission that was called the Resolving Concerns Packet. And it was some really early, like, fair Mormon apologetics for big issues. And there are things in that Resolving Concerns Packet, like, we still have it. I have it right over here on the bookshelf that are just like demonstrably untrue. Like apologists today would admit are untrue. Like one example I know of is it says in there that 27 of Joseph Smith's 30 like facsimile identifications, like his translations in the Book of Abraham facsimiles, are accurate or like supported by current Egyptological research.
Oh, okay.
And that's like absolutely just not true. But when you're a missionary and you don't have access to the internet, like you can't like fact check stuff like that. So I only bring that up to say there are very specific things that I feel like I'm not like I know my mission president probably didn't know that wasn't accurate. I'm not blaming any one individual person, but somebody knew. Like the scholars that were quoted in that would have known, or should have known, I guess I should say, that saying 27 of the 30 is accurate is just simply not reality. So I feel like I do have some betrayal trauma, but I feel like I feel like my relationship with the church is more or less in a good place, in the sense that I am able to appreciate some of those benefits that it gave me and gave my life, and recognize that there's this Buddhist parable about the raft. The man carrying the raft comes to the river, and rather than continue to carry it, he recognizes that the raft has served its purpose, and he's going to leave it behind for someone else. I feel like that's how I feel about the church mostly today. So rather than like focus or dwell on that betrayal trauma or feel like, hey, I was lied to, um, I think more I have been filled with a lot of compassion for even like early church leaders, even figures like Joseph, who are very complicated to me,
Mm,
because the more I've learned on this journey is just like how difficult it is to be a human, and
yeah.
that most people, for the most part, are motivated by good, sincere intentions. So I think that kind of brings me to your question about the witnesses. Um, I'll say that even as a believer, the witnesses were never compelling evidence to me. So I want to be really clear about that. And that might just be because I've always kind of been a little bit of a skeptic by nature, definitely more skeptical than most people I knew from Mormonism growing up. I don't know if it was my fascination with science from a young age or just the fact that I never felt like I had any type of really powerful spiritual or miraculous type experience that wasn't just feeling based. I don't really know. But I do know that I never really found the witnesses' testimony all that compelling. Um, the way that I grew up knowing about it is basically the very simplified version of the witnesses account, which is in the front of Books of Mormon or copies of the Book of Mormon
Right.
today. So the 3 and the 8 witness version. And I think one of the things I was most surprised by as I started to study things more in depth is just that the story was a lot more complicated. And so I'm not going to necessarily go to the whole spiritual eyes vision kind of debate. To me, it's a lot more simple than that, actually. It's just as simple as looking at the account that's in the copies of the Book of Mormon contrasted to like the actual history of the church account makes it so much more, I think, realistic and so much more complicated. So what I kind of have to recognize is that I had based my testimony in part on a very simplified narrative that
Mm,
even according to like the church's own material isn't the way it really happened. And so for folks who don't know the difference between the two different accounts, the version that's in the copies of the Book of Mormon is just very simple, a very simple testimony about like this is what we saw, we handled the plates, we had this experience with an angel. The history of the church account basically has a lot more complexity to it, where the three witnesses and Joseph go into the woods to pray. I think they pray several times and nothing happens. So Martin Harris feels like he's impeding whatever vision is happening. So he leaves. Then there's so already, I guess that's one of the ways where that it becomes a lot more complicated, right? Is if you just look at the version in the copies of the Book of Mormon, it's represented, I think, more as this group experience that they had all together, all three of them had together with Joseph,
mm,
where according to the history of the church account, it's a lot more complicated than that. You basically have David, Oliver, and Joseph having experience, and then Joseph going to find Martin after Martin departs, and then them having a separate experience. And I think even when you look at like the words that Martin says, not that I'm necessarily trying to say here's a naturalistic explanation for it, because I'll talk kind of about why I feel the way I do about it in a second. But
sure.
Martin says something like, when Joseph asks him, like, do you see whatever vision that Joseph's experiencing? Martin says something like, it is enough, or I've seen enough, something
Yes,
like that.
tis enough. Mine eyes have
Yeah, tis
beheld.
enough. Yeah. So it's just a lot more complicated. And I think that then kind of brings me to the way that I just view all kind of eyewitness testimony is having been an attorney, having seen people in court like swear to having experienced things that I know they definitely did not experience because I'm going to play an on-body video that shows the exact opposite of what they just said. Um, it's just very difficult for me, and this is again where I think you and I can have such a fruitful discussion on this, because I can just acknowledge like maybe I'm too skeptical that for me eyewitness testimony for this type of claim simply is never going to be sufficient for me to believe that it actually happened. And that's not to say that means that I think there was some collusion or some type of conspiracy or that these individuals were lying. I think the other thing that I have recognized, um, and I'll share why in just a second, is that spiritual experiences are reframed by our brains and reframed by our memory in ways that we don't even fully recognize. And I say that because I had this experience where, like most people who are on their mission, I had one of these experiences that I had been bearing testimony about for years, like a very powerful spiritual experience where I felt like a companion and I had encountered some like dark spirit and we were praying and having this experience. And it was very interesting to me in the middle of my faith crisis to find my actual mission journal and compare the version I had been testifying to about this account for years, this own experience that I had had, and then to go read my actual journal account from the day that that experience had happened. And what I saw was, I think, what science about memory and religious experience kind of shows us is I had aggregated and exaggerated some of the claims in the way I had represented that for like about a decade since it had happened, that just were slightly more faith affirming, more exaggerated than what had actually occurred when I looked at my own handwriting from that very night when it had occurred. And
Mm,
I didn't know that. And that to me is the most interesting part about what that experience basically taught me is I had no intention to change, to add to that experience, to make it more miraculous. But over time, as I was accessing that memory, I just feel like that's exactly what had happened. And I could see it in my own life. And so when I'm able to see that in my own life and realize like I couldn't even trust my own memory, it probably goes without saying why it then becomes very difficult for me to view someone else's memory of a spiritual experience that's being recorded after the fact as like I'm good to take this as a literal event that happened exactly the way that it's recorded. So I would say the way I make sense of it today is I feel like my worldview allows me to legitimate the or make legitimate the witness's experience in the sense that I absolutely believe that they were true believers and that something happened. I
Mm.
just don't necessarily believe the claims about the way reality works that accompany validating that experience in the way that I maybe used to.
No, that makes sense. So in summary, it sounds that you never viewed the witnesses sort of in the first place as compelling evidence anyway, and you don't find eyewitness testimony or people who claim to visionary claims or spiritual experiences to be, shall we say, reliable for, say, physical claims about how the world works. And you're also saying that you think memory can maybe change over time, or perhaps people might embellish or exaggerate unintentionally. But in
Mhm.
general, it just sounds that you don't see sort of eyewitness testimony of visionary things to really have any, well, would credibility be the wrong word, or any evidence to it?
Well, I don't want to say credibility because makes it sound like I'm saying that this is all imagined and it's not happening. I
Mm.
think what the science of religious belief shows us. So there's this great presentation if people haven't seen it. It's a TEDx talk from Salt Lake from about 10, 15 years ago by a guy named Michael Ferguson. He's a neuroscientist and he's talking about the TED talk is called "This Is Your Brain on God,"
Oh,
and
I think I've
he's
watched that.
explaining.
Yes, I think I've
Yeah,
seen
and
that.
he actually did a study involving Latter-day Saints, and one of the things that I think his research shows is that there's an element of expectation in religious experience. And the way he showed that is in his study, he put people inside of an MRI machine, or maybe it was a different type of machine. MRI doesn't make sense. He put them in a machine where he's
And
allowed
yes, I know what you
to,
mean.
yeah, where he's able to basically gauge and they're able to indicate the depth of the spiritual experience they feel like they're having during this experience. And one of the things that he showed by the way he set up the study was he basically showed people quotes from in group and out group spiritual leaders. And one of the things that's really interesting about the study is probably as expected, right? He did the study at the time that President Monson was still president of the church. And so he had quotes from President Monson, he had quotes from President Uchtdorf, and I think quotes from Elder Holland. And he was sharing these quotes with believing Latter day Saints and then comparing how much they said they were feeling the spirit to quotes from folks like Desmond Tutu, Billy Graham, and I can't remember who the last outgroup figure was. But the twist, I guess, in the experiment is none of the quotes came from the people they were attributed to. They all came from C.S. Lewis. And so one of the things that's very interesting about that study that he did is in the study, Latter-day Saints were indicating that they were feeling the spirit greater for these in-group spiritual leaders, but the quotes weren't actually coming from those in-group spiritual leaders. So to me, what
Mm.
that helps show us is not that these spiritual experiences are not credible in the sense that that's me saying like they didn't happen.
Right, right.
I believe that they happen. They're part of our normal human experience, and that the claims that are attached to reality about those accounts are the part that's where I get off the bus, basically,
Right. So
is
you see it as they're sincere. They maybe had those experiences, but they're subjective, internal, and it doesn't speak to what actually happened in the external world or claims about how reality works.
exactly. And at the time I was a believer, I made sense of how feeling heavy experiencing the spirit was for me, again, because I had never seen anything or really experienced anything supernatural. Um, the way I made sense of this was by going to the story in Luke of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, where, for people who aren't familiar with the story, I think it's in Luke 24, where Jesus, basically, for some reason that isn't really explained in the text, appears and walks with these two disciples to Emmaus. And the text tells us that he hid his true identity from them, and we don't really understand why. Like it's cagey about how that works. Um, but it says while they're walking that he being Christ, explains all the scriptures concerning the Messiah to these two disciples as they're walking on this road to Emmaus. And then as they get on the road to Emmaus, or as they get to Emmaus and they're having dinner together, it says that they realized who he was, and then he like disappears. Is basically the way that the text reads.
Mm.
And the interesting thing to me about that story always was that the disciples don't say, once Christ disappears. Like, how did we not recognize him? We spent all this time like following this guy. They say like, how did we not recognize that our hearts burned within us by the way while he explained to us the scriptures concerning himself? Something to that effect. I'm
Yeah, something
paraphrasing
like
it, but
that.
only barely. And to me, that experience always was used as kind of a self apologetic of why the feeling of feeling the spirit is just or more important than like witnessing some type of actual miraculous or supernatural event. So that's kind
Sign.
of how I made sense of how to view scripture, really. That was a really foundational story for me on how to understand scripture.
Very good. I can remember what my point was before that when I lost my
Great.
train of thought. It was whenever I brought up about when people leave the church, when people say they can't leave it alone, I can sort of understand like those people who, step away, why
Hmm.
they still want to, talk about or research and unpack and you deconstruct, as people say on podcasts. And I feel like for myself, since my faith crisis, I've not been able to leave alone all of the issues and questions and doubts either. I've not been able to stop thinking about these things, and it sort of got me to the point where I needed to start this podcast because I needed to find a way to try to talk through and think through some of these things and try to make sense of some things. So while it can be a pejorative, people can say to people who leave the church, if I leave the church tomorrow, I couldn't stop thinking about Mormonism and talking about and
Right.
researching into it, and vice versa. I can't leave alone or leave behind my faith crisis and all the doubts and issues I had. So I think we need to be understanding of people that this is such a huge part of like their identity, their worldview, their life up until this point. And I think as well, if we as critics and apologists or believers and unbelievers, I think
Hmm.
when we talk together, we can understand each other's point of view and perspectives, but we can also, at least I found, that you kind of can refine your positions, and sometimes you can
Hmm.
learn from an argument they have or a response they can give to an argument that you have, and it can sort of cause you to refine your position. I think the more we talk, the more we can, I guess, come closer to the truth, but also
Hmm.
understand that, hey, we might interpret things differently. So that made a lot of
Right.
sense, your perspective on the witnesses. I guess I'll briefly share my experience. Similar to you, growing up, the witnesses were not ever part of my testimony. My
Hmm.
testimony was very much founded upon spiritual experiences, praying about the Book of Mormon, believing I had that burning in the bosom and spiritual manifestation, other experiences, feeling, Christ's love and grace, and believing that I witnessed answers to prayer or saw miracles.
Hmm.
And on my mission as a missionary, whenever you're, bearing your testimony or trying to convince people, to read the Book of Mormon and believe in the restoration, I would always point to like read the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is the evidence. Read it, ponder it, pray about it. I know in the introduction it mentions the witnesses in like one paragraph, and I think
Hmm.
sometimes when we read through it with an investigator, I might say, "Oh yeah," and some other people also saw the plates as well. But I never really used it as an apologetic argument. It was never part of my testimony. I don't think I could have even told you like who they were.
Hmm.
And it was after my mission, whenever I was in my faith crisis and encountering, like polygamy, different First Vision accounts, historical challenges with the Book of Mormon, whenever I was experiencing that faith crisis, that's when I was like, oh, how do I explain the witnesses? Because I knew the three witnesses had a vision of seeing the angel in the plates. How do I explain the eight witnesses? And whenever I turned to, I read through Grant Palmer's book. I
Hmm.
was listening a lot to the Tanners and read their book. Was reading through Mormon Think. I then was exposed to different quotes, such as like, the Stephen Burnett letter and
Yep.
the John A. Clark quote, and quotes about, the three witnesses. Martin says he saw with the eye of faith or with spiritual
Hmm.
eyes. I saw the places to see a city through a mountain, or quotes from people where Martin said he saw Jesus in the form of a deer. I was encountering a lot of these quotes that were calling into question for me the reliability of the official testimony. And
Sure.
I, whenever I looked at those quotes, it caused me to look at the official testimony through the lens of all these other statements and to be like, oh, I don't think they actually did see the angel in the plates. I think it was second sight. Graham Palmer talked a lot about that, about seeing with the eyes of their understanding or
Hmm.
with spiritual eyes. And with the eight as well, I think I would have interpreted. I remember watching Dan Vogel's video that the plates were covered in a cloth, and so
Hmm.
that was sort of how I dealt with the witnesses at that time. And yeah, I couldn't reconcile other issues I had. In the time that I was away from the church, and I mentioned to you before that I was going to Christian churches and still
Hmm.
believed in God and in Jesus, I can remember listening to a podcast with Dan Vogel on Mormon
Hmm.
Stories. And I remember he talked about his theory or hypothesis for the witnesses. And his theory was that it was some sort of either mass hallucination or Joseph kind of induced this hypnosis
Right.
in some way, and that he had somehow fashioned together his own set of tin plates. And even though I was like an unbeliever at this time, I remember at the time just feeling a little bit like, yeah, I find that a little bit hard to believe, but I was sort of like, no, maybe sort of thing. But I remember at the time not feeling fully convinced by that explanation.
Hmm.
And something this by no means caused me to believe again. It was primarily spiritual experiences and believing that I had
Sure.
a revelation that sort of brought me back to church.
Sure.
And there was obviously lots of things going on at this time. But I remember I was turning to, looking at some apologetic things again. And I don't know if you've seen the series LDS Truth Claims on YouTube, but I
By McDonald, right?
yes.
Yes.
So I'd come across that, and I've been listening to some of his episodes, and he did a few on the witnesses of the gold plates.
Hmm.
And whenever I was listening to his episode, he went through a bunch of statements from, Martin and Oliver and David Whitmer, and also some for the eight witnesses that I hadn't actually read or heard about before.
Sure.
And a lot of them were, either first or second hand statements or interviews, but a lot of them did align with and support and corroborate the official testimony that
Hmm.
they saw the angel, they saw the place, they heard the voice of God. To them, they believe they saw it with their eyes and heard with their ears. And I remember listening to a video by David Snell on Saints Unscripted. He did some on the witnesses, and he had like just a series of quotes. And I remember like reading through a lot of them. And since then, I've done a lot more research, and
Hmm.
I can't say I've read every single statement, but I've read probably the vast majority of them. And something that was a little bit of a aha moment for me, it was because I felt similar probably to yourself and a lot of people.
Hmm.
Whenever I lost my faith, I felt very betrayed by the church. I felt like we were presented a very whitewashed history. There wasn't full transparency. And I really struggled with some of the issues with polygamy or different First Vision accounts or all
Right.
those things. And I think I viewed critics as the truth tellers, and this is the full complete history. And something that I recognized that whenever I read through Grant Palmer's book or the Tanners or Von Brody, and when they talked about the witnesses, I had sort of thought like, oh, these are all the sources that we have on the witnesses, and the official
Sure.
testimony is not reliable. But what I found, and I guess my position now would be, at the time, whenever I looked at a lot of their other statements, I would argue I believe the majority of their primary statements and also interviews, secondhand statements, if you look at the totality of their statements sort of collectively,
Hmm.
both with the three and the eight, I believe that they do align with and are consistent with and reaffirm the official testimony. And I
Hmm.
guess I sort of felt at that time, maybe not like a Dan Vogel, because he had his early Mormon documents, so he would have collected a lot of them, but at least in the chapters that they would have done the witnesses or the videos, I felt like they were omitting a lot of
Sure.
their primary statements. And I remember
Hmm.
at the time, recognizing that, obviously the church is biased and the church is presenting a very faith-promoting narrative. But it was the first time I sort of saw that maybe there's some bias coming from the
Sure.
critics. And I sort of saw it as, what, if I'm really about the truth, I want to have access to all the statements and then come to my own conclusion. And I felt like it was a little bit, I don't want to say misleading because I don't want to say that I think there was deceitful motives, but
Right.
to present, say, 10 statements, but that's only maybe 5% of like the total statements, and to
Hmm.
make it seem that's what they're claiming about their experience. My view is we should try to present as much of the data. Now, of course, you can't
Sure.
present in a chapter in a video every single source, but to give as much as you can so people have more of a informed, balanced view of what they're actually claiming. So I think
Hmm.
my current view on the three and the eight witnesses, and I don't believe that it's proof. I don't believe that this is automatic. That this means the the plates were ancient or it's divine, or that Joseph was a prophet. But as I've looked at the collective testimony of the three and the eight witnesses, my personal view is I believe the majority of their statements do align with their official testimony. And the reason I did my response video to the LDS discussion series is I felt that one, the criticisms they were giving of the witnesses I didn't find particularly strong. And
Hmm.
I also felt the need of, if you're just going to focus on a few second or third hand statements, be like, this is what they claim. It's all, spiritualized or eye of faith. We need to address those quotes. We need to look at them, but we also shouldn't ignore, and we should also look at the vast majority of their statements, and then people can come to their own conclusion. I think my view on it is I would see it as corroborating, I guess, an argument in favor. If I had two scales of like reasons to believe and not believe, I think I would put them more in the reasons to believe. And I
Sure.
didn't see the criticisms leveled against them as strong as I initially did. And I think I also feel that I struggled with the naturalistic theories of Joseph creating his own set of metal plates or inducing hallucinations, viewing those things as improbable, but also recognizing that it still requires faith. But
Hmm.
ultimately, the reason I believed again was primarily spiritual experiences. And without
Sure.
that, the witness's experience alone wouldn't be enough. But I think the point that I was trying to make in the episode I made is, if we're about, informed consent or full transparency, and I get those people that feel the church has not been fully transparent. I think they're with Drew Smith papers and the essays, they're getting more transparent.
Hmm.
But I also feel that critics weren't always fully transparent on the topic of the
Sure.
witnesses. And people should look at them all and then decide for themselves where they come down. And I totally understand someone saying, well, even if I agree with you that the majority of their statements align with the official testimony, I can still understand someone saying that still isn't enough evidence for me. But I guess I sort of feel that we should represent their testimonies accurately and fairly, and to use as much of the data and the sources as we can.
Oh yeah, I absolutely no disagreement from me on that because I
Oh, good.
I absolutely believe everybody should get a full picture of the evidence and then make their determination. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about evaluating church history claims, like um, when it comes to trying to make sense of like different accounts, and not just on this issue, right? Like whether it's plural marriage, other historical issues, first vision controversies. I think one of the most difficult parts is to recognize that Mormon church history was like a moving and evolving target, and they're similar to how you don't feel that maybe inaccurate or not full disclosure from the critical side isn't always accompanied by intent to deceive. I feel the exact same way because
Yes.
I've having seen that in that experience I had of my own where I wasn't trying to exaggerate my claim and yet I was in this one spiritual experience that I had recorded in my mission journal. I feel like that gave me a lot more compassion to recognize that like anytime we're telling an account like after it's already happened, we're using memory to access it. We're always, just as a nature of being human, we're always going to reinterpret that account based on where we're at in our life today and what we believe today. So that's why I do try and, we could have discussion back and forth about which quotes say which things. But the big reason I kind of didn't want to do that is to me, it doesn't really matter because I do kind of just acknowledge on the front end, even if I say, yes, I believe that they experienced the something close to the official count that they say they experience account that they say they experienced in the
Mhm.
front of the copies of the Book of Mormon, it just isn't sufficient evidence for me to believe that those claims actually happened. And I think with your acknowledgement that you primarily believe based on spiritual experiences and spiritual experiences you've had with the Book of Mormon, I think my believing self would agree with that really strongly. I would say probably my biggest testimony builder in the Book of Mormon actually came from Alma 32 when it talks about faith and trying the word and almost looks at it like an experiment, where you basically try a system and see. You can also see it in like John 7, where Christ says, if any man will do my will, he will know of the doctrine, whether I speak of God or I speak of myself, something to that effect.
Mm.
You can tell it's been a
Yeah,
while since I've been quoting scripture,
I
but
know that verse. I
um,
like that one.
yeah, to me, the way I piece those things together is basically what good came from the system. And I think during the time I believed in the Book of Mormon, I would have fallen back on arguments like that. I remember even, my friend that I discussed the CS letter with, we had a really in-depth discussion one night about Book of Mormon anachronisms. And I basically just acknowledged, like, yeah, there are things in the Book of Mormon that should not exist in the Book of Mormon. I don't know exactly how to explain that, but what I do know is that the Book of Mormon has been a positive influence in my life, and then kind of fallen back on this same set of scriptures to say that that's primarily what my testimony was based on. So,
Mm.
I think with that acknowledgement, I mean, I think that's the thing I like about your approach to sharing your perspective and apologetics, if I can use that word, is because I think you're really honest about the things that you believe based on faith and the things that you believe maybe based purely on like evidentiary value. And I
Mm.
think that's where we just should expect people to go. And then people who don't believe can be honest the same direction. I think my one follow up question, maybe about the witnesses, if you don't mind,
Oh yeah.
is I think one of the things that does become like a complicating factor for me in like acknowledging that I believe they legitimately probably were trying to describe an experience they actually had is just recognizing, and I'm not like bringing up specific quotes with this example, but my view is that kind of all of and I know more about the three than the eight witnesses, and I know a little bit about some of the unofficial witnesses like Mary Whitmer and Josiah Stowell. I think one of the things that does make it really difficult for me to like take at face value their, like, not that they didn't have a legitimate experience, but that legitimate experience means what they thought it meant, is just kind of the nature of the world they lived in, and kind of like that magical worldview that I think a lot of people, not just involved in Mormonism, just involved in that area of America at that time, really had. So my view on probably why I'm not as willing to take it at face value that it actually happened and means what they say it means is informed by that. How have you made sense of that, or have you thought about that kind of magical worldview, or do I have the evidence wrong there that maybe they didn't have as magical a worldview as I think they do?
No, I think that's a good question because I think they were part of this magical worldview. I think it was more of a visionary culture. I think more people are claiming
Yeah.
visions in that time. So that's certainly an argument that someone could make is that if they were prone to believe in magical things, or if this is more a visionary culture, could they be more susceptible or more primed to
Hmm.
have a visionary experience as opposed to people like ourselves, or someone who is more skeptical, or someone who is more scientific.
Hmm.
I think what I would say is I think, like, for example, like if Oliver Cowdery believed in, for example, a dowsing rod
Right.
worked, I don't think that necessarily means that he is therefore gullible and he's so superstitious that he could easily be convinced to see a vision.
Sure.
Like, for example, there's maybe things that I believe in that some might perceive as superstitious, like believing that, if I pray for help, that I might get help, or pray that I turn to the scriptures and receive inspiration. But I don't necessarily think that I am well, I've not had a vision. I'd love to have a vision. Would be necessarily gullible or easily tricked into having a vision, if that makes sense. But I could understand somebody, if I did claim that, oh, I've seen the angel appeared, someone could make that argument. I think that's something to consider. And the other thing I would say is, other than
Before you
Oliver
do that,
Cowdery,
before you
oh,
do that, can I pause you for a second and just say, to me, it's not necessarily like could they have been tricked or could they have exaggerated?
or
To
sort
me,
of like
it's
an
actually
hallucinated,
to me
or
it's actually more of a it's more of a context thing in the sense that when these people claimed to have seen an angel and to have had this experience, it's more like, okay, I'm trying to think of how to describe this. Are you familiar with the Nolan Batman trilogy?
No.
Oh,
That's
dang
not the
it.
Dark Knight one?
Yeah, The Dark Knight.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. Okay, yeah, I am,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. I used to have this weird theory that the scriptures were like the Nolan Batman trilogy in this sense, okay? The Batman comics are crazy and weird and exaggerated, and the movies are a lot more grounded in reality. And I viewed the scriptures like the exaggerated comic book versions of actual events that happened. And so I guess
Mm.
just so that I'm clearly kind of stating the reason I asked the question, um, it's not necessarily saying because they believed in a magical worldview, they had like a lower epistemic bar or they were more willing to be susceptible to tricks or hallucination. I think I'm actually saying it helps me contextualize the claims of knowing the way that these people saw the world. If that's helpful, that's the way I meant the question.
Okay, I get what you mean. So I think what I would say is, like, while there are later quotes referring to Martin Harris, like seeing Jesus in the form of a deer and being very gullible and
Right.
superstitious, I think some of those need to be read. I shouldn't dismiss those, of course. I think some of those should be read in the context of people and neighbors saying that after his claims of being
Right.
a witness of the Book of Mormon, there's many people who would say about David and Martin that they found it hard to reconcile their character of, like, say, honesty or integrity or being upright in business with
Hmm.
believing in this delusion. It's almost like, how do you
Sure.
reconcile that? At least when it comes to David Whitmer, I don't see him claiming anywhere else where he's had a visionary experience. So I feel like the angel and the plates experience was very unique to him. But I will acknowledge that it seemed they believed in, treasure digging and seer
Sure.
stones and dowsing rods. So I think that was certainly part of the culture. But I think certainly when it came to Martin and David, from a lot of the statements that I've read, and I'm not aware of him claiming, like he's having visions all the time. It seems like this was a very unique and a very powerful
Right.
experience to them. Now with Oliver, he also claimed to have other visions with Joseph Smith. So I can understand somebody saying that if they were part of this magical worldview and they had more of a visionary culture or mindset, they might be more susceptible. I think
Hmm.
I just don't think that because, for example, if Oliver believed divining rods might work, or they
Right.
believed in seer stone. Hey, I'm a believer, so I have to believe the seer stone somehow worked. That necessarily means that they could be easily convinced
Sure.
to see an angel in plates, if you understand.
No, I do. Can I ask one more follow-up question
Yeah.
about that? So the other thing I guess that's interesting to me about the witnesses is to treat their experience as grand, I think, as the official account claims. One of the other things that does kind of contextually make me take it a little bit looser is like their subsequent either affiliation or disaffiliation with the church. And
Mm,
so like to state it real plainly, right? Like David Whitmer, I think 1887 writes Address to All Believers in Christ and basically talks about like yes, and the church has used this quote for decades about how he still upholds his testimony of the Book of Mormon and he makes that clear in Address to All Believers in Christ. But he also like talks about Joseph Smith as a fallen prophet for several different reasons.
mhm.
And I guess my question is, and then, Martin associated with several different religious movements
Right. Yeah.
after Mormonism comes back to Mormonism. He was a witness for James Strang. I think one of my, I guess my contextual questions is just like, is that what you would expect? I guess I'll say it this way. If the experience was as literal and as powerful as the official account makes it out to be, the evidence I see in their subsequent behavior, even acknowledging that they maintain their testimonies of the Book of Mormon, it's very difficult for me to wrap my head around. And maybe it's just because I've never had an experience like that, right? But it's very difficult for me to be Oliver Cowdery or be David Whitmer and have had an experience that's reported as literally having happened, seeing an angel, hearing the voice of God, and then ever not continuing on with that
With the church.
church and that religious movement. Does that help? Maybe how have you made sense of basically like the witness's subsequent behavior as far as like contextualizing what they may or may not have seen?
Right, that's a good question. Um, Obviously, it can appear challenging to learn that, oh, all three witnesses left the church at one point. Um,
Hmm.
but what I would say to that is none of them ever denied having that experience,
Hmm.
and they all reaffirmed seeing the angels, seeing the plates. I remember, I think it was Thomas B. Marsh. He asked David and Oliver, did you really see the angel in the plates? And they said yes. And it's like, well, why don't you stand any longer with Joseph? And they believed that he was a prophet, but that they believed that he had fallen. Obviously, in the time of the Kirtland Bank crisis, and
Hmm.
Oliver had issues over Fanny
Fanny.
Alger and other
Hmm.
things, selling some of his land in Missouri. So I think it's very much possible that they believed that he was a prophet. None of them ever deny, and they were absolutely adamant that they really saw the angel in the plates. But
Hmm.
they could have had knocks to their faith where they felt disillusioned, and they might feel like, I don't know if I can no longer sustain Joseph or be part of the church. Obviously, you probably know that Oliver and Martin do come back,
Right.
but they're kind of floating around. Like especially Martin, he's sort of floating around to different groups. But so some might see him as he's unstable, but I see him as very stable in his testimony of the Book of Mormon. So even though you might say like, well, why don't you believe them when David Whitmer, no longer comes back to the church or
Hmm.
believes Joseph is a fallen prophet? I guess I I believe he could have some incorrect sort of views or theological views, but he
Hmm.
stays true to what he believes he experienced. I think I would also say that that would have been the opportunity for them if they had doubts about the reality of the experience, if they had a thought, hey, maybe this was hallucination or hypnosis, this might have been a time where they might have reevaluated it, being like, maybe Joseph did something to cause it. And
Hmm.
from all the statements that I have looked at, I think I've looked at it quite thoroughly, that they're very adamant that they know what they experienced.
Hmm.
But yeah, they all go through seasons where they at least lose faith that Joseph is still God's prophet and in the church. But ultimately, Oliver and Martin do come back and get rebaptized. But I see all of them as they hold true to that experience. And I could see it similarly that I could believe that I had a real profound spiritual experience, but then
Hmm.
I could reinterpret it and be like, well, I don't think that means the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the Lord's church.
Sure.
But I could still be holding on or bearing testimony just as strongly that that experience really happened. If that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And I figured that would kind of be the answer, but I wanted to make sure that I was kind of understanding your perspective. Because, yeah, as far as I've seen too, they did maintain their testimony in the Book of Mormon. I think it's those other questions of like, man, I guess it's just very difficult for me. And again, probably because I've never experienced any experience that even approaches that. It's just so hard for me to make sense of someone experiencing something that they're reporting as being so literal, and
Hmm.
then like allowing something like land deals to like get in the way of something like that. It's just very difficult for me to reconcile that and make sense of that, I guess. But it, yes, everything you said is absolutely accurate, that they did maintain their testimony of the Book of Mormon. So it's always kind of been a question in my mind of like, yeah, what
And,
exactly was
and
going
to
on
me,
there?
just to clarify, I
Sure.
don't believe they ever doubted, even when they stepped away from the church, they ever doubted that Joseph was a true prophet or doubted that the Book of Mormon was divine or doubted the plates. I think it was very much at that point they thought, well, he must have fallen because of things that are happening. And
Right.
I like personally, I think that even with dramatic spiritual experiences, people can fall away or they might see something in the church or with church leadership that they just think, hey, I think this is wrong. I don't know if I agree with this. And
Hmm.
they won't see it as they're denying their testimony or experience, but they feel like I can no longer be part of this.
Hmm. Yeah, that
If
makes
that makes
sense.
sense. So
Yeah,
so
no, it does make sense.
I guess a quick question I have for you, and this
Sure.
might be something that we might agree on. I feel from looking at both the eight witnesses, whether or not you want to interpret as they saw it covered in a cloth or
Hmm.
actually saw the plates with engravings on it, but also from unofficial witnesses like family members, Catherine, William, his parents, people like Josiah Stowell, Emma Smith, moving the plates. I
Hmm.
feel that there's substantial evidence. Well, I think the evidence is very compelling that there certainly was a plate artifact. I feel like I'm
Hmm.
convinced by that. Whether or not you want to
Hmm.
posit ancient or modern, I feel that there was some sort of plate artifact that Joseph created that he had under the cloth. Would you agree that there was a plate artifact?
I would agree that, yeah, I basically followed Dan's theory on this, that I think Joseph Smith did create a rudimentary set of modern plates that were used. I think one of the reasons I'm convinced of that also is the delay in getting the plates. I understand Joseph had
The
theological
4 years.
explanations.
Hmm.
Yeah, basically like the 4 years and the continuing, coming back, and he'll get the plates the next year, he'll get the plates the next year. I feel like that is a likely explanation for what, basically, for the time that gave Joseph Smith to develop some set of rudimentary, probably tin plates.
Mm.
That's my feeling. Yeah, and Josiah Stowell. It's interesting that you brought up Josiah Stowell because he's a real interesting one to me in the sense that, um, as I've studied Stowell's kind of like life and his testimony at the 1826 South Bainbridge trial
Hmm.
involving Joseph for glass licking. And maybe I'm judging I know more about the three witnesses than the eight witnesses, so I want to be really clear about that.
Okay.
I need to do a bigger deep dive on the eight witnesses. But when it comes to like the unofficial witnesses, like Stoll, I think I view Stoll very much in kind of that magical worldview camp based on his testimony at the 1826 trial, or the notes from his testimony. If I remember right, there's basically a confrontation when he's being questioned where he explains that he'd hired Joseph to do money digging, and it tells a couple stories of treasure digging um, incidents. One of them where Joseph Smith finds a feather, and there was supposed to be like a trunk of money under the feather, and the thing keeps digging. I think the thing that's very interesting to me about at least what's recorded from the testimony of Stoll is, even though Joseph never found any money according to Stoll's own testimony, he still testified in the trial that he was absolutely convinced Joseph Smith had the
Had the gift.
ability to find the money, and that he still had the gift. And
Mm.
so there's part of me that like looks at testimony like that, and again, I'm not imputing any like intent to deceive on any of these people. I just view it as like context for like how to take their statements, like how literally to take their statements. When I see someone like that who
Mm.
basically has, I would say, really clear evidence that Joseph Smith can't do what he's claiming to do according to his own testimony, like he never found the treasure that he was looking for. It's very hard for me then to take, his account of being kind of an unofficial witness of the plates all that seriously. But maybe I'm doing being too harsh on Josiah. I don't know. What do you think?
So I think there's maybe a distinction between someone's belief and what somebody is a witness of. So, for example, he could be mistaken in his belief that Joseph was a prophet, or mistaken that the plates were delivered from an angel. But I
Hmm.
think for me, I don't see any reason to call into question his statement of the plates, because he says that Joseph passed the plates, he held them, he
Right.
saw, I think, a corner of the plates, and they had sort of a
A
gold and greenish
greenish.
hue. Yeah.
Hmm.
And again, I guess I don't see the reason to doubt that testimony, because I feel like it corroborates other people that he had some sort of a plate
Sure.
artifact. And I think even if you went with a naturalistic explanation, believing the plates are modern, I still don't think that's a reason to throw out Josiah Stowell's experience of holding the plates and passing them, even if you think that he could be mistaken when it comes to Joseph's gifts or being a prophet. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily say I view it as like, oh, this is automatically disqualifying when we understand a little bit more about this magical worldview stuff. To me, it's more just how do I contextualize their claims?
Mm.
And I guess I look at that very much like I look at like prepping for witness testimony in court. Like I used to do trial work. I don't do trial work anymore, but when I did trial work, and like prepped for depositions with the witnesses and stuff, this was a big part of the way I looked at it, is basically like helping the jury understand kind of like the unstated implicit epistemological assumptions someone's making when they're making claims. And so I guess I'm just saying that to say I'm not saying because Stoll has kind of this, at least in my view, this problematic testimony in 1826, that means I'm throwing his testimony out. It's more just like I'm recontextualizing it and
I
recognizing,
see.
like, I don't know how solid an epistemology the guy had. He definitely experienced something. And you know, the fact that I am willing to believe and do believe that Joseph Smith created a set of modern plates, I think shows it's not that I'm throwing that testimony out, I guess. I would just say it makes me a lot more suspicious of the conclusion that's
Right.
reached because of the account, even if I think the account itself probably is more or less him trying to accurately report what he experienced.
And my quick
Um,
response to that would be
yeah,
that
sure.
I don't think apologists or believers should use his account. That does not corroborate the plates being ancient or authentic. I think what the unofficial or informal witnesses corroborate is that there was in fact a plate artifact. Because not usually
Gotcha.
serious critics, but some people say Joseph just didn't really have any plates. And I think what
Yeah,
they all affirm is that no, there definitely was a plate artifact, but I don't think we can use them to say, therefore, it's an ancient
I
artifact,
see. Okay.
if that makes
That makes
sense.
a lot of no, that makes a ton of sense to me. I will say, since we're talking about the plate artifact, one of the reasons that I'm convinced Joseph Smith likely did create a set of modern plates is
Mm,
because of how rarely the plates do kind of appear in the narrative, right? Like there were so many times when he's translating and the plates are in a completely separate location or hidden away. And I understand there's explanations for that too. Like Joseph's trying to keep the plates safe, but in my view, it also suggest to me like there's something about this plate artifact that they were very much like used only for special occasions or on special when I say special occasions, I don't mean like they were commemorating something, just that it was a rarer occurrence that the plate artifact was viewed.
one,
Let me ask
one.
you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna give a quick response to that. One
Sure.
interesting apologetic, which is a possible explanation, is that I've heard. I remember watching a video on this. I think Don Bradley talked about it. Is
Mm,
comparing the artifacts, the plates, the Sword of Laban, the Urim and Thummim, Liahona, all those being like the Nephite Ark of the Covenant, and almost this precedent for only certain individuals being allowed to be shown them,
mm,
sort of the similarities to that. And I think as well in the Book of Mormon it says that they would only be shown to a few
right.
that would sort of be permitted or commanded. I guess because often I have heard critics say the reason Joseph didn't show them to everyone is because they didn't pass visual inspection. And
Hmm.
my quick pushback to that is, as I've read the majority of the eight witnesses, and you said you're not as familiar with them,
Hmm.
um, I think the Burnett letter is the strongest source that people use to say it's Burnett who's quoting Martin Harris, and Martin Harris
Right.
said that the eight witnesses never saw the plates and
Right.
they only saw them, covered in a cloth. But as I've looked at the other statements of the eight witnesses, first or second hand or being interviewed, I feel like they're very consistent with the official testimony that they did see the plates naturally. There's even one interview with John Whitmer where he was asked, "Did you see the plates covered in a cloth?" And he says no. And there's many other statements where they're like, "No, I saw them naturally. I saw the plates. I handled them." Hiram Smith once said, "I have two eyes and two hands. I saw the plates with my
Hmm.
eyes and handled with my hands." And again, setting aside ancient, divine, or modern, from a historical perspective, and I obviously respect Dan Vogel, but I disagree with him when he comes to his evaluation of the eight witnesses. As I've looked at the majority of their statements collectively, I'm convinced that they were shown and saw some sort of plate artifact with the appearance of gold, with engravings on it, and it was natural. As I've looked at all their statements, I don't believe they were brought to them covered in a cloth. And again, the quote from Burnett that he's quoting Martin Harris, I think it's either he's conflating things Martin Harris said, or that might have been Martin Harris's view, because Martin only saw it like in a vision. Whenever he was
Right.
described, the plates were always covered in a cloth. So perhaps Martin might have thought you couldn't see the plates naturally; you could only see them in a supernatural way, or maybe that's the way
Sure.
Burnett interpreted it. But I sort of, instead of interpreting the experience of the eight witnesses based on what Burnett's letter says, which is coming from Martin Harris, supposedly, who I'm sure would have had acquaintance with the eight witnesses. I see it as, well, when I look at all of the other statements of the eight witnesses, some of them firsthand, some of them interviews, all of them seem to align with the official testimony. So I seem to think, no, Joseph did create plates with the appearance of gold, with engravings, which, again, I don't think that proves the plates are ancient, but I think it makes it more impressive that I don't think it was just a stack of tin. I think he had to have done something to make them look authentic. Now, of course, the eight witnesses themselves couldn't determine if they're ancient or not. And there's a source from John Whitmer. It was when he was talking to Theodore Turley. So it was after he had apostatized from the church.
Mm-hmm.
And he was criticizing Turley for still being, following Joseph Smith. And I'm paraphrasing, but Turley says something like, well, you're one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, but you no longer believe? Like, how does that work? And he says, like, well, I saw and handled the plates. There are fine engravings of both sides. I handled them, but I don't know if the characters are authentic or the translation's correct. So even when he was at his sort of most disillusioned, even at this point, it seems like he doesn't believe Joseph's a prophet at this time or the divinity of the Book of Mormon. He's still saying, well, I did see and handle plates. So I see it as their statements collectively, I feel, do align with the official testimony that they saw and handled plates with the appearance of gold, with engravings on it, they saw and handled. And that to me seems like more of an impressive metallurgical fraud than just, a stack of plates covered in a cloth. And I don't know if you watched the Eight Witnesses Mormon Stories episode, but I remember at the end when they were going through what was their sort of conclusion on the Eight Witnesses, John was like, okay, either ancient plates or Joseph made plates that had the appearance of gold with engravings on it, or plates covered in cloth, or they were part of a conspiracy. And I think it was Mike said that I believe they were covered in a cloth. And it was some spiritual viewing. And then John brought up, he was like, but what about all these statements where they say it wasn't with a cloth or they make it sound really natural? And I remember, then John said, I don't believe Joseph could have created plates the way they're describing. So I think they must have been covered with a cloth. And my sort of critique of that is that I feel that conclusion goes against the majority of their statements.
Of those first-hand accounts.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's impossible that Joseph could have created gold plates with engravings on it that duped the eight witnesses. I just think that's more of an impressive metallurgical fabrication than just, a stack of tin covered in a cloth. If that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. And thank you for sharing that. I think it I guess prompts another question for me. And this is more of like an epistemological question, but I guess just because kind of acknowledging that I'm never quite sure how to evaluate eyewitness testimony, especially when it does seem like it is explainable by some type of physical artifact Joseph probably could have created. At the very least, I think we would both agree, like, it's more likely when we're dealing with like Occam's razor, right? It's more likely that Joseph Smith created some version even of an advanced nature of fake plates than that he really received. If we're just talking like pure probability, right? That's probably more likely than him receiving plates from an angel that were buried in upstate New York. Or maybe you don't agree with that. I don't know.
I guess it can depend on your presuppositions, but I would agree if it was just the eight witnesses alone, because we have, James Strang made plates. People made the Kinderhook plates there.
Kinderhook plates.
Do you remember those Saudi Arabian plates? Was it Saudi Arabia? Like the last year or two. So I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility. I think when it comes to Joseph making his own set of plates, I would say there's no evidence of, any people accusing him of it, any eyewitnesses. Did he have the metallurgical skill? Did he get someone to make them? So, but I can understand that perspective that, well, that would make more logical sense, practical sense than an angel and gold plates. I think if I sort of combine the 3 and the 8, I think it sort of increases probability or makes it more of an impressive combined fraud, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and actually, okay, so that's helpful. My actual question, what I was trying to lead to is, when I'm looking at like trying to evaluate their claims, I think one of the things, just because eyewitness testimony is so difficult, when I can't like question or ask the person any follow-up questions myself, right? We're dealing with usually accounts that are usually not contemporaneous, at least is my understanding. Most of the accounts we're dealing with, even if they're first or second hand, they're like far after the events for the most part, is my understanding. I guess then where my mind goes is looking for like the testable parts that are implicit in those claims. And so I'll give you an example.
Mm,
For the plates to have existed and for this story to have been accurate, there were other artifacts involved that you talked about, like that Don Bradley's talked about, right? Like the sword, the Liahona. To me, all of those are interesting, but the actual most basic one is the stone box. One of the things that's interesting to me is I remember doing a deep dive on this a few years ago. Have you ever done a deep dive on like the stone box, the history of the stone box? Because it seems like understanding that these other artifacts had some, at least in the narrative, right? Like had some divine tie and they needed to go back to wherever the Lord was going to keep them. I don't think there was any such claim for the stone box, which my understanding is was just a stone box. And
mm.
it's, I guess it's surprising to me. Have you ever done a deep dive on like, well, what happened to the
I've
stone
not done an
box? Why isn't
episode on
it?
it. I remember reading through what you call him? He wrote a book on the resurrection and the witnesses. Josh Galey of
Mm,
the Church of Jesus Christ. He had a
yep.
chapter that talked a lot about the stone box. Unfortunately, I don't remember a lot of the sources on it, so I probably can't argue too much on it. I think my recollection was sort of around the time of Joseph Smith. I seem to remember like Oliver and David claiming that they went to the hill and seeing, either where the stone box was or like the hole in the hill, but then
Hmm.
later it might have washed away. But I've not
Right.
looked at the sources well enough to really to have a good
That's the
argument.
basic story I understand too. Is I think it was David goes back to the hill and it's basically he says it's washed out. It's only several years later. I guess the reason I look at it that way is just because it acknowledging kind of like the special pleading problem inherent in any eyewitness claim. Because I guess that was kind of my last thought that I'd prepared
Mm,
is even if we were to take all, this is at least the way I look at it, right? Even if I were to take all of the complicating factors of this testimony, the magical worldview stuff, if I were to take all of this out of the equation, and I feel like I'm then still confronted with this fact of, but there are also miraculous claims for other contradictory faith systems, some of which are
mm,
much better attested, or better attested in the sense that there are more witnesses, right? Like the miracle at Fatima. You
mm.
look at stuff like that, and I'm like, well, those are contradictory faith claims. Although I know Mormon theology has kind of explanations around that, that they're not actually necessarily conflicting in the way most people would think, right? But I guess that's where my mind goes is like to avoid like the special pleading problem. I guess my brain then goes, well, if I can't really make heads or tails of even if I were to take their testimony at face value, whether I believe it actually happened exactly the way they're telling me, then when I go look at like actual things that I think probably should be there, right? Like the stone box, I guess it's very convenient, I guess is the way I would put it, that the stone box is able to be in place for multiple thousands of years and then within just a few short years is completely absent now from the hill. I guess if that makes sense. It's like anytime I
That
feel
makes
like
sense.
anytime I feel like every time there is an actual testable claim for Joseph Smith for Mormonism, I don't see the evidence that I would expect to see in reality. And so I guess then maybe it just pivots back to, well, that's what faith is for. And then I think it's just an epistemological question of do you view faith as a valid path to truth or do you not view faith as a valid path to truth? I don't know. I know there was a lot I kind of said there, but
No, that's okay.
I guess that's kind of where my
With
my
the
brain
stone
goes
box,
next.
I'll have to concede that I don't know the sources well enough. So
Sure.
I know Josh has done a lot of work in that. I might maybe consult his book. I don't know if you've read his book. I think
I
he did an
haven't.
episode on Word Radio on the
Oh,
stone box, so I think he's more familiar with it. But I'll have to look into
okay.
the arguments with the stone box. With what you said
And
about,
I mean, that's just one example for the record. It's not like my my whatever the reverse of a
You're
testimony
debunking.
is hangs on. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not like it hangs on the stone box. It's just one of those examples where it's like I feel like every time there are testable claims about what Joseph Smith says he was doing, they always fail. Whether it's the Book of Abraham and the papyri, whether it's the stuff with Zelph, whether it's him identifying like specific artifacts as having been or specific ruins and artifacts as having been Nephite artifacts. I just feel like I would love to see like some actual like yes, this is solid and isn't subjective just because it feels like all the places where there is real solid stuff like we've talked about here, there is some legitimacy to these accounts, but
Hmm.
eyewitness testimony is inherently subjective and it feels like anytime there's a non-subjective testable thing for Mormonism, it just doesn't match up. I'll give you one last example. Just yesterday, I recorded a LDS discussions episode with John and Julia and Nemo, where we were looking at the use of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, and we were comparing Isaiah in the Book of Mormon to the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is 1,000 year earlier version of the Book of Isaiah, completely intact from 125 BC. And to make a very long episode very short, there's not a single instance where the deviations between the King James version of Isaiah and the Book of Mormon versions of Isaiah agree with the Great Isaiah Scroll. Like not a single instance. And yet, if the brass plates narrative, if the narrative in the text is true, that is what we would expect to find. So I guess maybe I'm kind of giving you a chance to conclude on just kind of maybe our epistemological differences, but I just feel like I sincerely have looked. And when I look, I feel like there's never a time that looking has been vindicated in favor of Mormonism, except in these cases where it's subjective, very subjective types of evidence, I guess I would say. So, do you have
Okay,
any
I
thoughts
understand
on
your point.
that, or am I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
too skeptical?
So let's see. I'll talk about your first point because I don't want to forget about that. And then if
Sure.
I forget, remind me of that one again because you brought
Great.
up other people having visionary experiences or mass vision.
Hmm.
So are we doing special pleading when it comes to the witnesses? I think my view is I don't think we should outright dismiss other people's
Hmm.
visionary claims. I think I would agree with you. It would be special pleading, and I sometimes feel like Christians do it with the accounts, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, but then
Absolutely.
dismiss the witnesses of the gold plates. Because really, if you're just looking at it objectively, there's better historical evidence, more eyewitness statements
Right.
for the witnesses. I've looked at the Wikipedia article, I think, on Fatima and the Day of the Sun. I'll have to be honest,
Hmm.
I've not looked at all the accounts, but I believe there's thousands of people that claimed they saw Their Lady Mary Fatima and the sun
Hmm.
moving and dancing. Obviously, I find that kind of obviously I'm skeptical of the sun doing those things, but yeah, thousands of people claim to see it. I'm I would just say I am open to other people having like afterlife experiences or visions and don't outright dismiss them. I also don't think that I think you have to evaluate each one on its own merit. So I don't think necessarily
Sure.
if you believe in one vision, you have to believe in them all or vice versa. Like I'll give you one example. I remember a few years ago, I don't know if you've seen the series Unsolved Mysteries on
Hmm.
Netflix. Yeah,
Hmm.
so there's one on UFOs sightings, and I'll be honest with you, I'm completely agnostic on UFOs. I don't care if they exist or if they don't. It's not part of my worldview. I don't have a lot hanging on it. And I watched it a few years ago with a family member who has left the church, and she was just like, "No, I'm not convinced." My memory is so it was in the 1990s. I think it was in Michigan
Hmm.
that about something around like 200 people on one night claimed to see UFO in this village
Hmm.
independently, and they're getting all these calls to the police station. A policeman was called, and he went, and he was skeptical, but then he claimed to see it. And there's this meteorologist who detected something on the radar, something moving really fast, which seemed to correspond with and be consistent with the eyewitness testimony. I don't know, it's an unsolved mystery. And I remember at the time thinking, like, you know what, like, I don't know, I wasn't there. I can't be certain that they really saw what they did. And I don't think it's unreasonable for someone to be like, yeah, no, I don't believe it. I don't buy it. Like, I'm not convinced. Because I've never seen a UFO. It's kind of a crazy claim. But I
Right.
also thought to myself, like, 200 people all imagining on the same night. They saw something, then it was detected on, this radar by the meteorologist. Like, I don't like maybe UFOs are real. Like, who am I to say no, that definitely didn't happen? And all of them just imagining it on that same night also seems like highly improbable.
Hmm.
And if I were to honestly make a guess of what happened that night, I think they probably did see what they saw. And some might think,
Hmm.
oh, you're delusional, you're crazy. But I feel like both sort of like the combination of all the eyewitness testimony and the radar detecting something, I think in my mind that I put my bet on, I think they probably did see and
Hmm.
experience that because I also think it's as highly improbable as it seems to see like a UFO. I also think it's highly improbable that all of them just imagined it independently. Um,
Sure.
so that's sort of, I think I would use that similarly when it comes to the witnesses. Now, I'd probably say there's probably better eyewitness testimony for that UFO sighting, but I would see it as like, if Joseph not only like orally dictated the Book of Mormon, but if he's the author, he promised or prophesied the three witnesses would have a vision of the angel in the plates, which then, he pulled off and they had this mass hallucination, even though, Martin was separate after, but sort of like two simultaneous visions. I see that as,
Hmm.
it's quite improbable and quite remarkable that Joseph was able to promise and prophesy that and pull that off. And then he fashioned his own set of plates, which to me, in my reading of the eight witnesses, had to be with the appearance of gold and fine engravings on it. That's the way I read their testimony. And then, then was had the oral skills and religious and creative genius to dictate the Book of Mormon. We'll bracket historicity for the time being. I
Hmm.
see that as I can totally understand somebody being like, I don't buy it. I don't think there's evidence. The thought of Joseph just going to a hill and an angel giving him gold plates, and then he translated with a rock and a hat, and then the angel took the plates back, being like, "That's absurd. That's ridiculous." I remember telling a guy on my mission about that, and he was like, "That's a fairy story you're believing," and I was like, "Oh." But when I also think about like, okay, if Joseph made this up, like orally dictating the Book of Mormon in 2.5 months, 588 pages. That's, you know, whether or not you believe it's historical or not, that's just quite an
Hmm.
impressive thing to have done. It's quite
Sure.
unique. And then having the skill, the metallurgical skills to create the gold plates, to pass visual inspection for the eight, and then to promise and prophesy the three would have this mass vision and hallucination and pull it off. I don't see it as like that's impossible, but I find that if Joseph accomplished those things, h- equally highly improbable. So I
Sure.
see that sort of combined with my own spiritual experiences as that I feel that I am not, you might disagree with me, I don't feel that I am unreasonable or delusional for believing in it. I think I would argue similarly, if for like belief in God, I see that there's arguments for and against belief in God. The problem of evil,
Hmm.
as you talked about before, is a huge issue, and I think it's the most compelling argument against the existence of God, evil, and suffering.
Hmm.
Um, and the primary reason I believe in God is religious experience and answers to
Right.
prayer and spiritual experience. But I also think the fine tuning of the universe is quite a compelling argument. I'm just not convinced by the naturalistic explanation for it. But if you were to say, is that the foundation for your belief in God? I would say no. It's definitely religious experience. It's probably a secondary reason. But if I were to stop believing in God, I would struggle to intellectually explain the fine tuning of the universe unless there is some sort of creator or designer. And I think in a
Hmm.
similar vein, I find it hard to explain that how Joseph was able to do those all those three things: orally dictate the Book of Mormon, create fake metal plates with the appearance of gold, and uh, prophesy and then induce this mass hallucination, or they all happen to hallucinate it. I also find that highly improbable. So I sort of see it as, for me, I feel like both are quite hard to believe and miraculous. And obviously,
Sure.
with my own spiritual experience, that's ultimately why I lean with faith. But I think for me, even if I didn't have that spiritual belief, I would still think, man, like, how did Joseph pull that off? Like, that's an incredible fraud. Like, if you did those three things, I'd be
Hmm.
like, my goodness, Colby, that's impressive. Doesn't mean it's true, but I think like
Hmm.
I have to take this quite seriously because I don't know if anyone today could replicate that,
Hmm.
and therefore, am I sure that I think Joseph Smith was able to do that? Like, if there is the divine and the miraculous, if God can do miracles, this is probably a more compelling case for maybe there being a miracle. I
Yeah,
guess, what do
that
you think about
totally
that? I know I've
makes
said a lot there.
no. That totally makes sense to me. And yeah, I acknowledge that. I think one of my greatest disappointments about having been taught such a sanitized, whitewashed version of Mormon history growing up is that regardless of whether someone falls on the faith or not faith side of the line or is somewhere in between, Mormon history is insanely interesting. And
Oh
I
yeah,
feel like it was a
that's where
crime
we're
against us
completely
to
united.
yeah, it was like a crime to not teach us some of the complexity because one of the things I think that I guess is a little bit unique about me as an ex-Mormon is I feel like every good story, for the most part, every good story I learned about Joseph Smith is more or less accurate. I just feel like there are a lot of stories that complicate Joseph Smith's narrative that I was not taught that
Sure.
maybe add a lot more color to like who he was, both good and bad. But that's honestly like the biggest experience I had, like recontextualizing what I thought I knew about Joseph Smith by reading like Rough Stone Rolling and reading No Man Knows My History, kind of comparing between the
Yes.
two, reading some of Dan's work is just like, man, what a crazy, interesting figure. Like he was assassinated while running for president,
Yeah.
while, acting as lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion. Like he was just a crazy person. Like if you were
Oh,
to
it's
put
extraordinary.
down,
However you feel about
yeah.
Joseph, like the things that he claimed, the things that he did, he's an extraordinary American religious figure. Like claims
Hmm.
of having visions of God and Jesus and angels and dictating the Book of Mormon and start like trying to build Zion in different locations and the persecution and building temples and yeah, everything with running for president and being mayor of Nauvoo and his assassination. Like it's crazy history.
Hmm. It's crazy and it's crazy interesting. That's for
Yeah.
sure. I think on kind of like the general theism stuff, I won't launch us into another discussion. I'll just say I've done a lot. So after I left Mormonism, I did kind of pivot to a looser form of Christianity, then maybe to a looser form of deism. And I think I've even told you, kind of depending on the definition of terms, not to get all Jordan Peterson about it, but depending on what people mean by certain words, I would not disagree with describing myself as a deist,
Right.
depending on the day. I think the big problem or the big reason I don't necessarily like identify as a deist is it's basically like a completely meaningless proposition to believe in a non-interventionist deity that maybe pulled the ripcord on a universe and then walked away. It's like
Mm.
deism isn't ever going to send missionaries out knocking on doors
Not
because
going to
what
start a
would
religion with deism.
yeah, what would be the point, right? But I can definitely understand why fine-tuning arguments are compelling. It might, if we get a chance to talk again, it might be an interesting point of discussion because I do see that very differently. Just in the sense that I think the best explanation for what we see as fine-tuning is really easily summed up by Douglas Adams' analogy of the puddle. I'm not sure if you've ever seen it, but when you understand kind of like the pattern of we see in biological organisms, we see natural selection shaping organisms to fit into their environment. And if you're really following some cutting edge science on abiogenesis and the field of systems chemistry, there's some indication, and including experimentation, that shows that we see that same effect that we call natural selection in biological organisms mirrored in actual chemical systems. And there's actually a paper I've been reading, trying to wrap my head around, that talks about how basically life is a very efficient way for the universe to spin itself out of energy, basically to increase entropy. So might be a good jumping off point for a future discussion. Because I remember in your episode you recently did with Blake Ostler, I was listening to it this week, and I was sitting there going, "Oh man, there's a lot of stuff I disagree with here," but not because I like strongly disagree with it. I just see it slightly differently. But I can absolutely understand why those arguments are compelling because I do find so much beauty and majesty in the world around us. I think, and I think this is maybe what I'll conclude on. I
Mhm.
think one of the things that's interesting about where I'm at today is, at least for me, seeing that beauty in the world around us, just as one example, and in where I'm at in my belief today, allowing that beauty to stand completely for itself in the sense that it's not part of some overarching grander narrative. It just is what it is, right? I can experience a sunset with one of my kids on a walk around the block at the end of the day and just experience that experience for what it is and the beauty that it is, even though, I don't believe in an afterlife. I understand why people do. Um, and I can just find meaning in that moment and have it mean nothing else than what I choose to find the meaning in that moment. Um, that has been very beautiful and very spiritually, I would say, fulfilling for me today. But I acknowledge that people find value in different things. So I'll just end by saying I've really enjoyed our discussion today.
Yeah,
It's
me too.
been just as fulfilling as I thought it would be. So thank you for making space for having a conversation with someone who thinks differently than you. I do sincerely appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been really awesome. It's been really nice actually to get to know you more as well. And I think we need to have more of these conversations in the space because I think we can sometimes dehumanize the other
Hmm.
side, or we can see them as villains or enemies. And I also appreciate. I think you've been really thoughtful and really respectful and listened really well to me, sharing my thoughts and perspectives. And hopefully we learned a bit from each other. I'm sure there's going to be listeners from both sides who are going to say you should have pushed harder, but I think we're hoping to try to build bridges as well and have more conversation. And as well, like more people are going to go through faith crisis. People are going to leave the church or some might stay in. And I think it's somehow trying to model how we can have these conversations and listen to each other. And we might disagree without being disagreeable. I think it can be healing
Hmm.
to be like, you know what? I may not come to the same conclusion, but I believe that you're a good, honest, sincere person who is rational and not dishonest, and you've come to your conclusion. And also, hopefully, you might feel the same about me while
Hmm.
disagreeing with some things, and hopefully, we can have more of these conversations in this space. Because, yeah, the online division and rhetoric isn't good. However you feel about President Nelson, his talk on contention to me felt like an inspired message that we needed, both as members of the church, but just in the space with the political and religious climate, that I think more hearts will be softened and more bridges built as we have these conversations.
I completely agree. The last thing I would say is um, where I'm at today, I care so much more how people treat other people, like the principles they hold in their lives, than the reasons they hold those principles. So I think that's the other interesting part of this discussion is yes, I've really valued this conversation. You've treated me equally respectfully. I've loved getting to hear your perspective and understand like why you reached the conclusion you do. And I guess it's very clear to me that your beliefs are sincere and they motivate you to do good. And so the way I look at it today is like if you come to the same good principles on how to treat people because of Mormonism that I maybe needed to leave Mormonism to find, then who cares? As long as we agree on how to treat other people and how to treat each other, and that's with kindness and with honesty and integrity. I really don't care why people reach the conclusion they do, as long as we're treating each other the same way.
Love that. And also, I'll make a shout out for you proposed wanting to do a debate with someone on Book of Mormon historicity. Shout out to any apologists or believers who would like to do the debate. I think that would be great to see as well. And I
Sure.
think Steve Pinecker is one that was willing to host it, or if someone would only want to do it on my channel, I'd be willing to host it as well. That would be
I'm
fascinating to see.
I'll just say I'm much more willing to have like this type of discussion about Book of Mormon historicity than I
So, not
would
necessarily a
be to
debate.
do any type of debate. No, the only reason it became a debate is because the particular YouTuber we were talking about offered it as a debate. And I'm willing to do debate because I did debate in high school and I'm an attorney. But no, I'm much more interested in conversations like this where we're just honestly exchanging
Okay.
about, hey, this is why I see the evidence this way. This is a strong piece of evidence for why I don't see the Book of Mormon as historical. Because yeah, that actually has been what I've been putting a lot of my effort into is basically fleshing out my ideas of where I think the Book of Mormon came from, and it's going to continue over the next year probably.
Well, that's cool. And I'd be open to bring you back on to my channel again, probably in the new
Cool,
year. And we could
cool.
maybe talk a little about Book of Mormon history, just having a discussion. I think something like this where we share different points of view. I'd be happy to do that. I've been doing some episodes with Ganesh on his book, and I think they're enjoyable, fruitful conversations. So we could
Great.
talk about maybe doing that again in the new year.
Great. Sure. Yeah.
All right. Thanks,
That
Kolby.
would be great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. And listeners who've been watching, if you've enjoyed this video, give it a like and comment and share, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. Let me know if you're enjoying these collaborations I'm doing, speaking to former members or unbelievers as well. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.